Hi field botany folks. Today we're going to be introduced to some of the conifers. Conifers are cone-bearing gymnosperms. Now gymnosperms, you may remember from before, are naked seed plants. Gymno, naked, sperm refers to seed. Well, these are naked seed plants because most of the cones open up and expose the seeds, as opposed to flowering plants that have their seeds enclosed in a fruit. Now, these cones are going to be both male cones or pollen cones and seed or female cones. It's technically incorrect to call them male or female, but I'm not going to worry about that. So we're going to look at both of these types of cones. Here's some pollen or male cones, and you can see these needles are about maybe 2 inches long, so these cones are fairly small. These may be about 1.5 centimeters in length, and they're not woody because their job is just to produce the pollen, and when that's over, their job is done. But if we look at the seed or the female cones, they're much bigger. They can be anywhere up to about 1 foot long. This one's about 7 inches long, and they're woody or hard because they are going to be protecting the seeds. So these things, by the way, are called cone scales, and we'll be talking about those a little bit later. Now, there are 3 conifer families in California, and we will eventually learn all of them. But the pine family, the cypress family, and the yew family, today we're just going to learn some of the pine family, or Pinaceae. And so the Pinaceae includes both pines, which are actually in the genus Pinus, but also firs and Douglas firs and hemlocks and spruces, which we'll get to in another video. In California, pine family plants are evergreen, trees or shrubs. You may be familiar, for instance, with larch. Well, that's not in California, but that's a deciduous member of the pine family, a beautiful deciduous member of the pine family, but in California, evergreen. And the leaves are going to be needle-like. Most people are familiar with the needle-like leaves of pines. And we're going to have both the male and female cones on the same plant. And that is said to be monoecious. Mono for one, the ecious part refers to house. So we have one house that has both the male and female cones. And you can see over here that each cone scale will have had 2 seeds on top. You can see where the wing of one seed was and the wing of the other. And if you look in this one, you can see the depression where the actual body of the seed was, where the embryo would have been. So 2 seeds on top of each cone scale. Now, if we look now at the genus Pinus, okay, and students always get these two confused. Think, are you just in the family, Pinaceae, maybe in a different genus like firs, abies? Or are you also in the genus Pinus? Okay, so I'm giving you characteristics of this genus now. In this genus, we have the leaves bundled together. They're in bundles or fascicles of 1 to 5. 1? We'll get to that in just a moment, but let's imagine 2 to 5 for right now. This particular plant right here has fascicles where we have 2 needles bundled together. So we have the 2 needles bundled together in a fascicle. And so there's 2 needle pines, there's a lot of 3 needle pines, 5 needle pines, only 1 4 needle pine I can think of at the moment. And these things that bundle them together are papery, and they're called bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S. A bract is a modified leaf. And so this is how we can have a bundle of 1, because you can have a pine called Pinus monophylla, 1 leaf, that would have 1 needle with the bracts around it. And I have pictures of that. We'll get to that a little bit later. So, important characteristic of the Pinus genus. You have fascicles of needles. And also the female cones usually hang more or less upside down. Some of them, they're a little different arrangement around the main stems. But they remain intact more or less and fall off the tree, as opposed to something like a fir, where the cones sit upright and the cone scales just disintegrate while it's on the tree. Now, I'm going to be working mostly with the Sierra Nevada. There's lots of beautiful pines all over in California. There's some coastal, ones. But we're going to go up the Sierra. And so the first pine that you're going to encounter, the one that's lowest elevation, is Pinus sabiniana, known as gray pine, but it also can be called ghost pine or foothill pine. And you can sort of see that, well, I'll show you where it looks a little bit more ghosty, but it does have a gray color. And so you can find this in chaparral like here, or foothill woodland. And you can tell from a distance, it's the only pine in California that has this, in the Sierra, that has this rounded crown, as opposed to this pine over here, which is more pointed, which is more typical of what we think of pine tree shape. So rounded crown, okay, grayish color, wispy branches, very flexible branches, and you can sort of see through it, hence the name ghost pine. And you can see it is a 3-needle pine, so we have 3 needles bundled together. They're fairly long and stiff needles, okay, but wispy branches. Wispy branches. The cones, I should have gone back to that to show you, sorry about that. These are not quite open yet, but the cones are pretty heavy and massive, and they have these tips of the cone scales that are often quite elongate and curved. So it's not a good one to get hit on the head with, although there's a worse one that I can think of, coulter pine. Anyway, we're going to move up the Sierra, and when we get into the lower montane, the lower belt of the mountains, we encounter this 3-needle pine, which is ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa. Okay, and it is the one that was in the previous picture that has a more typical conical shape, which makes sense for shedding snow. Okay, when we were looking at Pinus sabiniana, that one is low enough that we typically don't get snow there. But in this lower montane, snow is going to be relatively common, or at least before global warming, it was relatively common. No, it still is. Okay. So ponderosa pine is sometimes called prickly ponderosa because you can see at the ends of the cone scales here, they have these prickles that stick more or less straight out. So you wouldn't want to say catch and throw someone a cone of this because ouch, that would really hurt. You can also see in the bark, we have plates, which I don't really show you the plate very well here, but on the plates we have these puzzle pieces that flake off. Very beautiful bark. Here's another pine, a little higher elevation. It is a 3-needle pine. We have plates also, not the puzzle pieces that I showed you before though. And this is Jeffrey pine, Pinus jeffreyi. And a really lovely pine. A lot of people like it because of its smell. If you stick your nose in a crack in the bark, and it's a warm day, okay, it has to be warm so it's, you know, the aroma, you can smell the aroma. People describe it as smelling like vanilla or butterscotch, but it's a lovely aroma. And I'll show you why it's called gentle Jeffrey in just a moment, but it does hybridize with Pinus ponderosa, so you can get crosses between them. So here is the Jeffrey pine, and you can see that these prickles point inward, more or less, so you don't have a problem, unless you stick your fingers in there, you don't have a problem getting stuck with these cones. So these cones, I didn't talk about sizes. These cones tend to be larger than the ponderosa pine cones, and it can, of course, you also can get hybrids. So these are ones, this one right here is probably about 7 inches long. I did just want to mention, even though I'm going up the west side of the Sierra, if you were to go over the crest onto the east side where it's drier, you'll find Jeffrey pines not only in the upper montane but down lower. Oftentimes that's just the only pine tree you will see, and it's often there with white fir, which is Not expected if you're used to what's on the west side of the slope. But you can see this very open area. These are all Jeffrey pines. All right, also in the upper montane zone, Pinus lambertiana, sugar pine. And sugar pine is the one that has these really long cones. A lot of people think they're very beautiful. Foot-long cones, you can see them hanging off the tips of the branches. This is a 5-needle pine, so there's 5 needles in a fascicle. And here's one of these foot-long cones. Notice that we don't have any prickles sticking out, rather gentle also on those. There we go, another cone. I'm giving you very brief introductions to these, but we can talk a little bit more about them in another video. This is lodgepole pine, and lodgepole pine is a subspecies of Pinus contorta. Pinus contorta subspecies Mariana, because this Pinus contorta also has other subspecies that are on the coast, such as shore pine or pygmy pine. But this one is a full-size tree, fairly straight, hence the name lodgepole pine, and this occurs in the Sierra as well as other areas. Now, it is a 2-needle pine. I'm not sure if you can see that over there. It's got fairly short and small cones. There is some variation in the size, but I think of usually up to about 2 inches long, and they're kind of more roundish when they open up rather than elongate. And the bark, let's see if we have a close-up on that. Oops, nope. The bark kind of looks like someone smashed potato chips on there. Very, very, I don't know, like smashed potato chips. I put this in to remind me that this, even though I'm talking about it as upper montane, it has a little bit more of a range than that. And also, it is one of these pine trees that can tolerate various conditions. So you can see it right here next to the water. So it's near mountain meadows and has, its roots practically in the water, but it can also exist in very dry areas. And here's the potato chip bark close up. Here you can see a little bit better the 2 needles in a fascicle and a close-up of the relatively small cones. One of my favorite pines, perhaps, although I have a lot of favorites, is western white pine, or Pinus monticola. It has almost a Dr. Seussian look sometimes, with these limbs sticking straight out, and you'll see another picture of the cones clustered together. It is related to the sugar pine, which is why the cones look fairly like a sugar pine that's smaller. So these are typically maybe 4 to 6 inches in length. And there's also usually a little bit of a curve to the cone. Notice there's no prickles on it. And you can see the clusters of the cones up there in western white pine. Western white pine, I didn't write it down, but it's also upper montane, up into subalpine. And here's the bark of mature trees. It takes a while for you to get this pattern, but a very characteristic look with these little blocks. This is, where is this? I forgot. Okay, moving farther up. So we're definitely in the subalpine. We've got white bark pine here, which is Pinus albicaulis. Alba refers to white, caulis refers to the stem, so white bark pine. And this is one of the pines that doesn't rely on wind dispersal for its seeds. I talked before about the seeds in the cone having wings. That's for wind dispersal. But there are some pines that have animal dispersed seeds, and this is one of them. And this is a Clark's nutcracker here that will peck at the cones, okay, and get them open. And the seeds actually don't really fall out very easily because of the shape of the cone scales. And so the birds will take the seeds and eat them and catch them, and that's how they're dispersed. And just another picture. There's the Clark's nutcracker up there. And this whitebark pine, this is over at Carson Pass, is, at high elevation, so you often see them flagged, or you see them having, so the wind's coming from one direction, or you see multiple stems, and it can be crumholtz. distorted and not very tall. Okay, I've got to just mention, no, it won't have you know this one, but the western bristlecone pine, Pinus longeva. It is the species with the longest lived individuals, and currently there's one over 5,200 and some years old. I have to look up the exact number. Sorry, I didn't do that before the video. And it is a 5-needle pine, relatively short 5 needles, very densely clothed branches, and here's one of the cones. So you won't need to know this, but it's a really cool tree, cool plant. Oop, something happened there. Okay, so this is the single leaf pinyon pine, Pinus monophylla. Okay, mono one, phylla leaf. And so this is the one where we have fascicles of 1 needle, and we have the cone. You can see the cone, very deep indentations because the seeds are very big for this, and these seeds also don't have wings and are animal dispersed, and they can be eaten as pine nuts, even though the main tree that sold as pine nuts is a European one. These are quite tasty and edible.